So just to like introduce myself a little bit, I'm Allison. Today we'll be talking about getting up to speed on new code bases. My pronouns are she, her, and I think that covers all the like super basic introductory level things. And also this will be less of a focus about you personally being able to get up to speed on things quickly and more of an institutional focus of what are some practices that you can bring into your workplace and your work culture to really facilitate that for everybody on your team. So just to give you a little bit more about my background, so I don't come through like a traditional like computer science degree background. In 2019, I graduated with a BS in neuroscience from Trinity University. I dabbled in computer science a little bit, took a handful of classes, but my main focus was neuroscience and music, much more life sciences-y. And then my first job out of college was a research assistant at the Children's Learning Institute under UT Health. So most of the projects that I were working on were focused on early childhood education, language, and literacy. And I'm like, happy to chit chat if you want to connect after this. But yeah, basically I was doing a lot of assessments with kids surrounding their language skills and verbal expression. In the spring of 2022, I decided to do a bit of a career change. I went through the Flatiron Bootcamp program where I learned how to code in Ruby and React. And now, also intersprinkled through all of this, I was teaching private music lessons, violin, cello, piano, and doing some tutoring. And then now, these days, I'm a junior developer at workforce.com, which is a SaaS company that focuses in workforce management, so scheduling, payroll. We're building a payroll product right now. It's very exciting, learning a lot about tax laws. So I know a fair about learning just from my professional background. And then also I've started my first tech job within the past year. So I'm kind of familiar with being kind of tossed in the deep end a little bit. So because things don't exist in a vacuum, I decided to send out a little informal survey to some of my friends and colleagues just to feel out what other people think about things in this area. Specifically, I was interested in what are some of your favorite tools when you're learning something new? What sorts of resources do you tend to go for? And then what do you really dislike? What is your least favorite kind of tool to work with? And so just a couple of patterns that emerged. It kind of corroborated my own experience, but collaboration is a super popular one among the resources that people really like to use. People really enjoy collaborating with their peers and asking other people questions. Definitely a love-hate relationship with documentation. Sometimes it's really useful, and then sometimes it really does not help you get on board at all. And then a lot of other miscellaneous online resources are also pretty popular. So people usually tend to draw from a wide variety of sources. And I also asked some more open-ended questions about what was helpful and then what absolutely sucked about your onboarding experiences, which also kind of validated my own experience and helped me narrow down some themes. So the main themes that kind of stood out to me are stress management, consistent patterns, and mentorship. So first things first, also get to put on my little neuroscience hat for a little bit here, is striking a balance between stimulation and stress. So one of the things that I want us to help all understand and to get us all on the same page is what is stress, making sure we have a common definition of what stress actually is. And so I feel like we tend to think about stress as mostly a mental experience or an emotional state, like we're feeling stressed, we're feeling worried, we're feeling all sorts of turbulent emotions. But stress is not just in your brain. It's physiological and it's psychological, and it's a cascade of effects in response to a stressful event. So basically what happens is there's either a physical threat or a perceived threat, And that sets off this chain of reactions in your whole entire body. So in the brain, it causes release of neurotransmitters that stimulate and really suppress some parts of the brain and activate others. It also triggers the release of all of these hormones from various glands throughout the body that cause this more long-term impact of stress because they're circulating in the blood, so they take longer to get where they need to go. And that's what causes the changes in blood pressure, increasing blood sugar, increasing your heart rate, slowing down digestion. And what's mostly important about this is that there's some impacts of stress that linger after the initial stressful event, like getting chased by a tiger or delivering a presentation. The good news is stress is not inherently bad. It's very evolutionarily advantageous, but it has some impacts on how we function. So stress can impair memory and retrieval, specifically updating memories, and it nudges your brain towards more rigid habitual learning versus more cognitive and flexible learning. So kind of the easiest way that I conceptualize it is it's very good for rote things. So like CPR is a fantastic example. That's those sorts of things where there's like very sequential steps where you're doing the same process every single time, kind of muscle memory things. Stress can actually kind of give you a little bit of a boost in those areas, just because when there's more emotionally salient things and the things that are tagged as more emotionally intense, sometimes they're easier to remember. Whereas if you're doing something that's a little bit more cognitively complex that involves like dissecting a problem or the creative problem solving, it's not, following the exact same sequential steps every time. It's a little bit more difficult. And so stress lowers activation in the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for rational decision making, processing complex information, directing attention. And so what this means is basically you might be working harder, you might be putting more effort towards directing your attention, but you have a little bit less to show for it, which adds barriers to things like task switching, which is something that we encounter a lot in our day-to-day work as engineers. But the good news is, since we're not getting eaten by tigers in our workplace, stress impacts are heavily influenced by our perception of the stressful event or environment. So there's actually a fair amount that we can do to kind of mitigate the impact of some of these stresses that might pop up. So some of the sources of stress that we might actually encounter in our workplace environment are things like imposter syndrome, communication breakdowns, and just kind of feeling overwhelmed by some facet of our work that we're doing, especially as newbies. So some of the critical components of imposter syndrome are not really being able to recognize your achievements as achievements that you did versus something that just kind of happened to you. So one of the easiest wins in terms of mitigating imposter syndrome is just recognizing accomplishments. So that might mean just having a more clear definition of what success looks like. So coming from mostly an education background, I'm used to grades being the metric of success. And so for me, one of the rough transitions into the workforce was I'm not necessarily getting a grade. How do I know that I'm doing a good job and I'm doing what I need to do? And so one of my mentors at my current job put it in a very nice and concise way. And basically, success is delivering value to our customers. So making our product easier to use, making them more satisfied while they're using it, building and implementing features that they actually need that make their life and scheduling and managing payroll easier. That's a win. That's what success looks like. Not necessarily delivering the absolute most perfect product or an amazing iteration as the very first version. There's a little bit more fluidity there. And one of the things that my workplace culture does is we shout out accomplishments fairly frequently, just recognizing what sorts of contributions people are making to the team or to projects, whether they're being especially helpful with code review, or they've just shipped a really exciting new feature. And then also just giving feedback, letting people know what they're doing well, where they can improve on, so you're not as much in your own head of trying to judge, how am I doing a good job? You have a little bit more external feedback. Some other facets that you can kind of bring to mitigating some of this imposter syndrome stress in your workplace is just doing as much as you can to help set up your new hires to succeed. So making sure that there's supporting resources if there's anything that's particularly unique about your code base, having some sort of like mentorship relationship set up. So having a more experienced buddy to ask questions, outlining very clear expectations of exactly what you expect to be done, because everyone's coming in from a different background. In an ideal scenario, obviously, with a more diverse workplace, but everyone's coming in with a different background. So everyone might have different levels of what they internally think is doing a good job versus what the kind of the workplace culture of doing a good job is. I know me personally, I tend to set the bar very high for myself, and then sometimes I'm stressing, and then I actually get a chance to speak with one of my more experienced coworkers. They're like, yeah, when I first started, like I didn't nail this concept until probably a couple months in, a year in. I didn't really start feeling comfortable until, a year and a half in. So you're actually doing fine. And then also ramp up tasks. So not always tossing people completely in the deep end, kind of incrementally stepping people up and giving them tasks that start smaller but still are just like a little bit outside of their current experience, just to give them some space to grow. And then team culture wise, just having diverse perspectives on your team. That's a really big win. Just because if, not everyone is thinking the same way, then there's a little bit more space to kind of feel out, okay, is this like a different way of thinking, or am I going about this the wrong way? And also just having some more frequent checkpoints, opportunities for feedback, and opportunities for collaboration also, just being able to see how other people work. Next up, we're going to talk about patterns, and this one is super fun. I have a little game that we're going to play. So let's see. We've got a little bit of a pattern matching game. So we have a dark gray fish, a white fish, a green fish. Next up, do we think it's going to be a purple fish or a whale? And we can do, what reactions do we have? We could do a sparkly heart for the fish and then a celebrate for the whale. Just a little bit of a fun poll time. I'm seeing a lot of sparkly hearts. Amazing. Yes, we are all so smart. It's a fish. It's pretty straightforward, right? We've got a whole bunch of fish. The next one's probably a fish. All right, so our next one is a little bit more challenging. We have a penguin, a platypus, a peacock. Next up, a duck or polar bear. And we can do sparkly heart for polar bear and the celebration for the duck. Okay, I'm seeing a little bit of a mix. So does anyone want to jump in either like verbally or in the chat if you chose why you chose your choice? Yeah, a lot of them have beaks. Polar bear starts with a P. They lay eggs. I think platypus. Yeah, platypi lay eggs. All right, cool. So yes, there's very justifiable reasons why it could be either choice. So in this case, it's the polar bear because our pattern is animals that start with a letter P. So this kind of highlights what I feel like we encounter a lot of times when we're working in a code base and we're super new, and we're sure there's a pattern. There's definitely a pattern connecting all of these pieces, but it's a little bit hard to really abstract what that example is without being explicitly told what it is. And so polar bear patterns are not inherently bad. Like sometimes there's very much a reason for them, but it's not as immediately obvious. So this is a sort of area where it's really helpful to have some sort of like newbie crash course or some supporting resources that really help you clarify like this is what the pattern is. Because we're all pretty smart. We can usually like figure things out. We can see some sort of pattern, but making sure that you're seeing the pattern that's intended. So let's see. Here we go. Some ways that you can actually bring better patterns into practice in your workplace. So PR bodies are a really helpful way to accomplish this. So I'm sure we all use GitHub as our predominant revision history, software version history management system. And so PR bodies are a really great place to kind of document what this change is, why it's happening, what it's related to, kind of what the intentions are. Something that my coworkers and I have started doing that's very helpful is if there's some sort of reason why we're doing something weird, something more polar bear pattern-y, we'll leave a comment in the PR itself with any sort of supporting resources. So for example, right now, we're working on building a payroll product. Nacha files are one of the file types we need to export in order to get people paid. And it took a little bit of digging to figure out what sort of file extension these files are actually supposed to have. So that was something that I left in a comment. So when you're using the git blame extension on VS Code or whatever your like coding environment of choice is, you can see, okay, when you go back to this PR, you'll be able to see this is why we chose the file extension that we did. And just something that I've started doing, a kind of a PR body format that I've decided that I'm a fan of is like a super short blurb about what the intended purpose is, a link to any sort of documents about what the project is. So we use the shape cycle at Workforce. So we have basically like a series of projects that are pitched throughout intended to be done in like 6 to 8 week chunks. And so this for me is just a link to like what the original project specs were, and then a little section for follow-up steps and related PRs, so that just in one place you can kind of see everything that's related to this split out into smaller sections. They're all part of the same cohesive whole, but you can see all of them in one place without having to do any sort of major scavenger hunting. Also, you know, documentation is the #1 complaint. It's a loved and hated resource, so anything we can do to make it better is awesome. So, other things we can do. Tests are actually really helpful, not just in knowing if you're breaking stuff, but also providing some insight into the intended behavior. And so that's probably in my workplace, the main way that we use tests is, you know, just a very quick litmus test of, am I breaking any sort of major intended functionality? Yeah, I don't know if you've ever tried to look up the documentation for turbo turbo or stimulus, but it's a little bit lacking. But as it gets better, you know, I'm sure feelings on that one will change, at least in my sense. But yeah, tests are super useful. And then also linters are super helpful just for making things more readable. So that's another facet of, yeah, so PR bodies. So when you have a project on GitHub or like an organization, and you have, especially if you're working in like a larger organization, so it's less comes up in personal projects where you're maybe one of 1 or 2 people working on it. But basically it's a document that if you have some sort of process for managing like so if there's like a project where you have to basically get a green light to be able to merge into master, you can't just kind of do it whenever. GitHub basically, it's kind of like this template document that when you create a new branch and you push it to the remote repository, it pops, the first time you push it, you can open up one of these little template things where you can add some additional information about what the change is, a little bit of additional context before you merge it in. So it's kind of a little bit of a process. I can also send add some links into the presentation. I'll share it out just with some additional, like, they have like a whole little help guide for like what a PR is, what its intended purpose is, that I can share out later. But very big fan of like PR bodies. They're very helpful just for organizing what is going on and what these changes are that are happening. So lenders, super helpful, keeping things repeatable. We use sorbet type checking as part of our code library, which is really helpful because it helps you know exactly what data type you're putting in and what data type you're expecting to get out of a function or whatever. Something that's also super helpful is namespacing. That namespacing is my new best friend, just to kind of help keep things organized of what conceptually belongs with what. So in my workplace, we're an international organization. So we have some things that are associated with the Australian part of the product. We have some things that are associated with the US portion of the product. And so namespacing is one of the main ways that we're partitioning those out, especially as we're working towards, getting payroll working in all 50 states, just to be able to keep things more organized. Also, it's really simple. Well, it's surprisingly complex, and it's surprising how often this can get kind of like pushed to the bottom of the hierarchy in terms of like maintaining code maintenance things, but just keeping your file structure organized. So not just having everything in one mega folder, but keeping things organized, finding a nice balance between not having like just file, and having to click a bazillion times to get to things, but having things conceptually grouped. Kind of similar to Ruby's convention over configuration mindset of, controllers do this, models do this, similar sort of thing. And I'm just going to take 1 second to catch up on the chat for just a second. Cool. Yep. All right. So final thing, thank you everyone for your patience, is teamwork makes the team work. So literally everyone, independent of what level they're at, from junior to senior, said something about coding along with a more experienced buddy as their favorite resource for getting oriented, for feeling more confident in what they're doing, and just that's their favorite learning tool, was coding with a more experienced buddy. So even though this is another thing that kind of sometimes gets a little bit pushed to the wayside, it's something that has incredible value for the team, even though it does have a little bit of an upfront cost in terms of time. So it helps everyone grow, first of all, both the person who's learning and the person who's teaching. It also is a really great way of catching some of those polar bear patterns, just because when you're working by yourself a little bit more independently in a vacuum, everything makes sense to you. But making sure that it also makes sense to your teammates, especially your teammates who are newer and have a little bit less background experience in some of the quirks and conventions of your product or your code base, is really helpful. There's been a handful of times where I've been collaborating with one of my more senior engineer work pals, and they've been like, yeah, I don't know why we did it that way. This is the pattern. This is what we're doing. I don't know why we made those choices, though. I'm sorry. And then also, just as a more global thing, everyone has something to offer. Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses, and more diverse perspectives make a stronger product, like 999 times out of 1,000. Just because you're not having any sort of large blind spots in your product or the way it works. And it also kind of helps kick imposter syndrome out the door and reduces stress and overwhelm, because you have a lot of different people weighing in and bringing their unique background experiences to the table. And so, yeah, and I think also sometimes as it's good to remember that diversity is multifaceted. So it's, sometimes, like obviously like gender diversity is great. No one wants to be working with just like a room full of like only dudes all of the time. But there's also diversity in just background and experience. So someone who's, an early 20-something is going to have a different experience than someone who's like 40 or 50. Someone who's coming from a traditional computer science, like 4-year degree or master's degree program is going to have a different experience than someone who came through a boot camp program. So all of those sorts of background differences are great and amazing and wonderful, and really help you make sure that you're covering all of your bases and you're making code that is not only quality, but is also readable for a diverse group, because, there's always going to be new people coming in and learning what you're about. And so some ways that you can facilitate this in the workplace and you can bring these sorts of practices into your team are having an assigned buddy or a project point of contact. Basically, someone to bother with all of your silly or not so silly questions, just so that you know who to go to. You know who probably has the answers. And also having semi-regular check-in meetings is great, especially if you're working with newbies that might be on the more shy end of the spectrum and might need a little bit more prompting to let you know what's going well and maybe what's not going well before they're too deep into it. So my team have started doing check-in meetings on Mondays, where we basically go over like, hey, this is what I'm working on. This is where I think I might need some help or assistance. Also, just so as a team, we can kind of manage our time best and know who might be having like a larger PR or a larger project coming up that needs review, versus like who might need a little bit of help in all these sorts of different areas, so that we have a heads up about that at the beginning of the week and we can prioritize our time as needed. Pair programming, also great, just because you can kind of bounce ideas off of each other. It takes a little bit more time up front sometimes, if there's like a little bit of a mismatch in experience levels or knowledge, but it provides more value than it costs in 9 times out of 10. And also you can collaborate in the sense of like kind of doing a little bit of training wheels action. So especially for your newer people, giving them kind of a progressive amount of autonomy. So not entirely, like holding their hand the whole entire time, but giving them this sort of like ramp up in terms when you're portioning out projects to your team, and giving them something that's just ever so slightly more than they can chew at the time, but they have the supporting resources to make it happen. So we're good. Also, like collaborating asynchronously is also great. And so you can do that in terms of code review. So even if you don't get the chance to actually be like physically or virtually in the same room together, looking at the same thing at the same time, there's also a lot of value in just being able to look at your teammates' work, even if you don't feel confident yourself, giving them the green light, like this looks great, looks like it's not going to break anything. You can still provide value just in asking clarifying questions about why they set something up a certain way and things like that. And so, yeah, basically just mentorship, teammateship, collaboration. It's not so much like a cherry on top, but more the whole ice cream cone. Da, 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 da. Alrighty. So some acknowledgements, a shout out to my friends and colleagues at workforce.com for being patient with all of my surveys and questions. RailsConf 2023 for basically giving me an excuse to pull this presentation together. First off, Women and Non-Binary Rubyists for inviting me to speak today. Freepik.com for all the domain images, and all of you for participating and being receptive. So and then I've also got all of the articles linked in, but any questions Any comments? Constructive criticism and feedback?
I really enjoyed